He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down into the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like the dust of wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's all the time.
This is an episode I'm very excited. I have Harrison Pitt. He's an academic, writer, and policy fellow at Restore UK. Really excited to have him on, man. Harrison, how you doing?
Thank you, sir. It's good to finally get this working.
Yeah, it's the holidays are always difficult, and I sort of quip to you, it's a good thing that our guys are very difficult to schedule. If we were all the stereotype of the lonely young man with nothing going on, where you could just record at the drop of a hat, it would almost be more worrisome, even if it is, sort of difficult to schedule around. So my audience is predominantly American. So Harrison, who are you and what do you do?
Well, yes, so I'm a writer, academic, and my main job day to day at the moment is to serve as a policy fellow at Restore Britain, not Restore UK, because the term UK cannot be used with a straight face anymore. From Americans who aren't aware of it, the UK has become a bit of a meme in British politics, spelt Yookai, to denote the sort of third world-defying post-national Britain that we increasingly see as Britons on the streets today. And so you get these sort of incongruous dynamics where on the one hand you see this magnificent Georgian facade at the top, but then underneath it there will be like a vape shop, or there will be Turkish barbers. And so the UKification of Britain is supposed to signify the way in which you have all of these sort of conflicting, chaotic, multicultural vernaculars alienating the host population of these islands. And the reason why the people have gone for the word UK is because it sounds a little bit like a sort of like a regional branch of some sort of globalist management structure. And because the kind of multicultural London patois will sort of emphasize words like UK, like that. And so it's supposed to be a kind of a joke on that. So yeah, Restore Britain, we're very keen on maintaining that branding, given the current meaning of the words UK and British politics. But yes, so we are a movement and a think tank founded by the independent MP, Rupert Lowe, who Americans no doubt know who Tucker Carlson is. Rupert Lowe was actually on Tucker's show the other day. So if people want to get a better sense of what Rupert Lowe is about, they should watch Tucker Carlson's interview with him. And he, earlier this year, fell out with Nigel Farage, much better known in your country, of Reform UK. They actually are called Reform UK, because, well, people speculate about it, but we are basically of the view that Farage was getting a little bit jealous of the rising popularity that Rupert Lowe was enjoying, both in America among figures like Elon Musk, but also in Britain itself among the more politically energetic, well-informed sections of the so-called online right. Rupert Lowe was gaining in popularity, and people think that Farage basically defenestrated him for that reason. There were some trumped-up charges of bullying and all the rest of it, and they even reported him to the police. And after an investigation commenced, no charges were brought. But this, parted things. And Rupert Lowe set up Restore Britain, independent think tank and movement, and we are now doing all sorts of things from producing audiovisual content to producing reports. Our first ever report is this one: mass deportations, legitimacy, legality, and logistics. Being a policy fellow, I had a big hand in writing this, and we're working on another one about how to bring an end to anarcho-tyranny in British politics. So trying to put practical meat on the policy bone rather than just lamenting about the state of Britain all the time, which is very fashionable and important to do, but not enough on its own. So that's our main function, I suppose, in the British political scene at the moment. And I'm honoured to have been given the role of senior policy fellow at Restore Britain so that I can be part of the solution rather than just being part of the chorus of discontent.
It's actually, I think it's a very important thing because it's become fashionable among a certain segment of the American right. And I would say it is related to the American right, but there isn't nearly as much crossover, which is this kind of jeering attitude, particularly in, Trump 2.0 towards England, right? You guys have it so bad. And look, it's certainly true, right? There are very bad things going on there. Even the idea that a politician would be criminally referred for bullying, which is sort of comedic. But there are several things that I think are important to mention there, right? Why that attitude is incorrect. One, we don't have it that much better, right? There are meaningful changes, but also the way that these, and when I say globalists, don't read Alex Jones, but people of that sort of persuasion, ideas tend to catch on, right? The many of the same, we saw this during, the pandemic in particular, that there is a transatlantic trade in horrible ideas about how to run a state. These are coming. And also, I mean, look, like there is a major, cultural affinity, right? We are cousins as far as nations go. And so the idea that you can simply, discard that and kind of jeer at it as like super California, like it's both in poor taste and I think very short-sighted. So you mentioned the fact that Nigel Farage is, relatively speaking, well known in America. And in America, there's sort of two views on him, which is either he is Britain's Trump, they're just the same guy, across the ocean, or alternately you get he is Mr. Brexit. He's the guy who got Brexit done. So how accurate are either one of those characterizations? I'm not trying to get you to talk bad about the man, but I'm looking for context. What role does he play, especially as his party is gaining prominence?
Yeah, so this is a very good question. He is on the Trump thing. There are sort of two things you could mean by the British Trump. Trump, obviously being an insurgent figure in American life who takes over the Republican Party and completely refashions it, particularly along the lines, as you know, of immigration, trade, and I guess the third would be foreign policy. So sort of America first on all of those things in a way that the neocon establishment had not been. So if we think of that way of thinking about it, he's not really Trumpian in terms of his character. I mean, he's a little bit bombastic, but he's bombastic in a sort of like British sort of pinstriped city boy type of way. He worked in the city, for which for us means the sort of financial district of London in the 1980s, which is all about, like wearing pinstripe suits. I think Wolf of Wall Street in British context in a way, like, but you're very much part of that kind of financialization of the economy, and you're sort of availing yourself of all the personal benefits of that, which I think was what Farage was doing in the 80s. But you go to the cricket on a Sunday and you sing the national anthem. So it's this sort of mixture of like sort of pinstripe, being a pinstriped yuppie, but also being a bit of a bulldog nationalist who likes the Battle of Britain and Churchill at the same time. So like Nigel Farage is actually very similar to Trump in my view in those ways as a personality. But of course, our Trump, if we're ever going to have a Trump in British politics who has the same sort of impact that Trump has in yours, would have to be sort of characteristically British. It can't just be an American copy and paste job, because though we are cousins, both culturally and indeed genetically, we have in the intervening 300 years or so, like developed like recognizably different national character traits. And I do think that it's important that Brits, in trying to avail themselves of all of the benefits of the Trumpian revolution in our own context, don't just try and transpose all of the features into the British context. For instance, I mean, this didn't even go down very well in America, but when Trump came out with that tasteless remark about the death of Rob Rayner, that was tasteless enough in an American context. But if someone were to do that in a British context, it would be considered even more tasteless, given that we're a little bit more uppity about the importance of respectability and all the rest of it than I think you are. There's a sort of brashness to the American spirit, which has its downsides and no doubt has its virtues as well. So those are sort of the personal ways in which I would compare them. On Brexit, I think that is just a complete misunderstanding. Like what Nigel Farage does deserve immense credit for is raising the salience of our membership of the European Union in the mind of the ordinary British voter. He definitely did do that. But the guy who got Brexit done is a little bit misleading, given the fact that when we did have the referendum in 2016, Farage was not in a position to be actually delivering the goods. That just delivered a result. And then the Tory government, as it then was tasked with, working out all of the details of our departure from the European Union. And this was particularly self-satirizing and absurd given the fact that many of the people within the Tory cabinet had advocated for Remain, and yet they were trying to hammer out a kind of Brexit settlement. This was one of the absurdities of Brexit that we had at the time. In many ways, it was a sort of poke in the eye of our political establishment, and it did. I suppose it can be viewed as having as being a sort of Trumpian-like moment in terms of its significance and scale. But we had an absurd situation where the parliamentary sovereignty and referendums, direct democratic style sovereignty, were in conflict with each other, because something like 85% of parliamentarians didn't want to leave the European Union, and yet they were the ones who were going to have to vote on the deal and make sure that it was okay and all the rest of it. And by that point, Farage had actually just left the picture. But in the 1990s, this is maybe something I can give for the American context. Wanting to leave the European Union was a minority interest among a small number of quite dorky conservative politicians, people you won't have heard of, like Bill Cash and people like John Redwood. I'm sure you haven't heard of these people. And they made a very dry, dusty, constitutionalist case for Brexit, which wasn't very sexy. Farage was very good at connecting Brexit to more ordinary salient concerns like immigration. And by doing that, he was able to raise awareness around the issue in a way that someone like Bill Cash, talking about the need to restore our Victorian antique constitution, was just never going to cut through to people in the way that Farage did. So he does deserve credit for that. But in my view, his powers when it comes to reshaping the mold of British politics and remaking the mold of British politics and breaking the frame of British politics does seem to be waning of late. He seems to be playing a much safer, risk-averse game, and no doubt that has a lot to do with the fact that whereas when he was running the ostentatious pro-Brexit pressure campaign, it was just that, a pressure campaign. Now he's wanting to enter government, and given that the rest of the political establishment finds itself in incredibly low water, he is not inclined to play the riskiest of all strategies. So he's actually playing it quite safe, and in my view, not being as radical as he could or indeed should be being.
You mentioned that both parties find themselves in dire straits. If you could provide a little bit of, shall we say, like electoral context. Mm-hmm. Obviously, you have this sort of explosive success of, Boris Johnson, flipping, a number of seats in the so-called, I think the term was the blue wall. Right?
The red wall, the colors are switched in our context, yes.
Something that will always trip me up. But yes, the kind of legacy, labor seats in the North. And at least I guess it was 7 or 8 years ago, which feels kind of crazy to say now. But it seems as if, right, the Conservative Party was massively empowered. Now they are facing an even more historic collapse after their most recent defeat. Can you explain that? Like, what happened between those 2 points, and how did we get to a situation where it seems as if the oldest political party in the world is effectively dissolving right before our eyes?
Yes, I think that in short, what happened was roughly millions of Indians, Nigerians, and Bangladeshis were imported en masse in a way that dwarfs anything that Britain has experienced in its history. And that was very much the doing of Boris Johnson, who, far from tightening restrictions on immigration in the way that his sort of national populist campaign of 2019 would have indicated that he was going to do, and he did say, or he said, but in the Conservative Party's election manifesto 2019, it was said that, I think something along the lines of, quote, overall numbers will come down. Not only did those numbers not go down, they went up significantly. I have taken to calling Boris Johnson the worst demographic vandal in the history of the British Isles. And not only did the numbers go up, but they were coming from the most culturally incompatible parts of the world. It used to be the case when we were members of the European Union, and this is actually one of the slight paradoxes of our time. On the one hand, you could actually make the case that continued membership of the European Union would have actually, even though all of the people who were pro-open borders were pro-remaining in the European Union, it probably would have been more consistent with the intuitions of restrictionists for us to remain members of the European Union, because when we were members of the European Union, the overwhelming majority of immigrants taking advantage of the freedom of movement rules that govern membership of the European Union were from culturally compatible countries who were who were net contributors to the treasury because they were professional and they worked. Who had no incentive to support anti-white identity politics because they were themselves Europeans, and were also most likely to return home after a given period of time anyway. We've now we've now not only upped immigration in quantitative terms, but made it much more hazardous in qualitative terms, because now most of our immigrants are coming from countries where, thanks to Boris Johnson, those three sort of saving graces, if you like, when it comes to European immigration, don't apply. There is an incentive to support anti-white identity politics. We're talking about very indolent third world immigrant populations who bring their dependents with them and who suck off the public teat. And the third, they're very unlikely to return home, because why would they, when they are benefiting from this sort of the parasitic relationship they have to the British people. So in a way, you could argue that in the short term, at least, hopefully in the long term, we can make good on this. But in the short term, Brexit incidentally had a very deleterious effect on Britain's demographics. And Boris Johnson has rightly been identified at last by the British electorate as the man culpable for that. And the Tory party has been identified as the vehicle that is responsible for that in institutional terms. And so they could come out with the most radical, frothing at the mouth rhetoric, Powellite rhetoric about how they're going to reverse it at this point. But it's unlikely, unless there's a significant personnel change, that they're ever going to be believed on that front. And because Farage, in the intervening period, wasn't anywhere near the levers of power and has been talking about immigration for some time, in my view, in substandard terms, but nevertheless, in sort of like vaguely healthy centre-right restrictionist terms, he is seen as the person to set it right. And so I think there is just an intuition on the part of British people in the pub at the moment and Nigel Farage is benefiting from this sort of, Nigel, he's sound, you can have a pint with Nigel and he'll sort the boats out. There's just this sort of rough calculation that people are making. And so he's the beneficiary of that. And Labour is not trusted at all on immigration because they're not sorting out the illegal immigrant crisis that we've got at the moment, despite promising to do so and smash the gangs and all the rest of it. The numbers of illegal entrants have only gone up since Labour came in 2024. And indeed, it was Labour themselves in 1997 under Tony Blair who initiated the whole mass immigration experiment in the first place. And so I think that it's mainly on immigration. It's mainly due to a perceived failure and a perceived unwillingness, in fact, to control Britain's borders and to maintain our very blessed homogeneous demographics, that people are flocking to Farage, as they seem to be doing at the moment.
So one more thing, and I'm doing all of this to provide context again. There's sort of a similar trend happening on the left. The Labour Party is losing even within the broader left-wing coalition. I know much less about this. I will be honest. I find American progressives irritating enough. And then if I listen to, Ash Sarkar, I can't say her name. It's a Star Wars name. It doesn't exist in my language. Or Owen Jones, I will have a stroke. So I just can't do it. But I don't necessarily understand why that coalition is splintering. Do you have any insight there?
I think I do. I could be wrong. I'm less attentive to what the left is doing than I am to what the right is doing. But I mean, obviously, the left in my country, as in yours, is completely riven apart by the whole Israel-Palestine blood feud. Keir Starmer finds himself in an awkward position where, on the one hand, he wants to detach himself from the period in Labour's history when Jeremy Corbyn, who you may have heard of, was leader of the Labour Party, and he had a sort of rap sheet of statements in the past where he'd said, our friends in Hamas and Hezbollah, and meeting with suspicious Islamist characters and all the rest of it. And so that he received accusations of anti-Semitism from within the Labour Party. I think on the one hand, Keir Starmer is very desperate to distinguish himself from the kind of legacy of Corbyn. So he very sort of performatively got rid of Corbyn when he became a leader of the Labour Party, because he wanted to sort of cleanse Labour of that awkward period. So on the one hand, he feels a serious need to like brandish his credentials with like the Zionist Labour factions, but then on the other hand, they're hemorrhaging support to increasingly explicitly Islamist candidates in parts of the country, in constituencies in Britain where Muslims do enjoy a critical mass. and so that they no longer need to go through the middleman of the Labour Party in order to air their grievances in Parliament. They can just set up their own candidates and count on the fact that they will win elections. So I think that it partly explains why it's in many ways a function of Britain's ethnic fractionalization, that the Labour Party feels riven between its sort of pro-Pally leftist tradition and its sort of pro-Zionist Labour tradition. So that's partly that. But then I think it's also the fact that Keir Starmer, though he is in many ways a very blinkered sort of ideologue, a sort of human rights radical, for whom to whom like the idea of politics is actually quite frightening. The idea that people actually have to make political decisions is terrifying. He would rather outsource it to a kind of priestly caste of left-wing human rights lawyers who in their wisdom are able to preclude the need for any kind of political wrangling whatsoever. So he's very wedded to that sort of post-war human rights framework. So he is an ideologue. I'm not saying that he's purely a pragmatic creature, but he's an ideologue who does find himself in power and who therefore is aware of the fact that reform is surging in the polls. So occasionally he will make these sort of pragmatic concessions to the right. And for that, he's seen as being a bit of a letdown to many people who are more sort of dogmatically and doggedly left-wing. So you can think of Keir Starmer at the moment. I've taken to describing him as sort of like a kind of left liberal human creature of human rights law, but with some pragmatic constraints. And I think a lot of what we're seeing with the Green Party, with Zach Polansky, for instance, is someone who is rising in popularity in many ways because he signals to the most sort of diehard activists on the left in Britain, not only his sort of anti-Zionist credentials, which matters to that faction, but also his disregard for any kind of pragmatic constraints whatsoever. So it means Zach Polansky literally visited Calais the other day, which is the part of France from which these illegal immigrants decamp in order to get into Britain. And he was like handing out water and, doing a photo op to show how much more pro-open borders he was than Keir Starmer. Whereas Keir Starmer has in fact got himself into a bit of a pickle where occasionally he'll make speeches talking about how Britain is descending into an island of strangers. And it sounds like sort of power-light rhetoric, but then he upsets his backbenchers on the Labour side, and then has to explain how he didn't really mean that, and he wasn't trying to beg any parallel with Powell and all the rest of it. So I just think he finds himself in a much like buffeted to and fro, and so you've got this kind of left-wing faction that is much happier just to say exactly what it's about, and I think that's partly what explains that. Well, I think those two factors are what explains the division.
Well, and you brought up something there that's interesting, because speaking of trends that we saw, first in your politics and then in ours, this sort of ethnic jostling within an existing party structure. Obviously, it's slightly different because we have a two-party system, right? There is no viable third party. So it sort of happens within the system of power. So for instance, this has already happened in California, where you have, these aging, boomer white and Jewish liberals who represent heavily Hispanic districts. Who are they being primaried by? Who are they being challenged by? Well, it's not, Nancy Pelosi 60 years younger. It is Hispanic nationalists. Hispanic nationalist is kind of a misnomer, but you understand what I mean.
They call them Chicano nationalists, don't they?
Yeah, I believe so. Or even in Minnesota more recently, Jacob Fry narrowly won out over a Somali interest candidate. He may have exploited some tribal politics there, which is sort of amusing to read about. But nonetheless, right, that you are starting to see that happen here. One other thing I think is interesting that you mentioned, right, is this sort of fight between those constrained, or those who make some sort of concessions to practical politics, and those who sort of go for the sort of red meat, right, what the base really wants. And I think that's been an interesting thing, because in my own party politics, there was sort of an open question for a while, which is, are our Democrats going to moderate? Are they going to make the correct electoral decision, sort of run to the center? They did that some places, like in my state, they had a candidate who was successfully able to paint herself as moderate. And yes, she won, partially due to having a very poor opponent, just due to kind of pendulum nature of electoral politics. But also what's interesting is that it seems like there's a part of the base unwilling to accept that as an answer. So for instance, Zohran Mamdani, who I've never read so many stupid articles about someone. The idea that this man is some sort of, like insane, jihadist is kind of absurd. He really is sort of an analog to, Sadiq Khan more than anything else, right? A globalist with, awfully convenient skin tone. But nonetheless, right, you see what is promised there. And he is promising, out and out racial redistribution, more taxes on white people. And you see, like, that is not going away, right? Even though, there is what would be the sensible position, tack towards the center, make concessions on certain issues. That may well be the correct answer, but it does not get you elected in, these sort of intramural conflicts where it is your base voting. In a place like New York City, there is no Republican challenger. We understand this, right? Similarly, it is within your own party, you're selecting for certain things. So, and forgive me if this is a provocative question, but if the state in your nation is grim, right? You have this problem with immigration, this problem with, this sort of explosion of violence. Why are you not a part of Reform UK? Surely that is, the rising star. So what are the issues with that group?
Well, I suppose the major problem with Reform UK is that they are very good at noticing and drawing attention to and wanting to rectify third, fourth, sometimes even fifth order consequences of the operating system that has brought us to this point. But they don't seem particularly keen on wondering where that has come from. So, for instance, they are still out and out avowed civic nationalists who are inclined to reduce what it means to be British to a set of bogus moral propositions. This is particularly, I believe that this is incoherent in every possible national context, but it's particularly incoherent in the British one, given that British values is something that only really entered our shared political lexicon in the 2000s, when Gordon Brown and Tony Blair started realizing, oh gosh, there are an awful lot of indigestible subcultures in this country who are, rather fly in the ointments of our globalist experiment. We need, in order to sort of tackle alienated, in order to tackle the problem of alienated Muslims turning to the most uncompromising forms of Salafism, we need a whole new sort of national values program, counter-terror program that tries to center national values. But because that would have seemed, it would have seemed overly, it would have seemed very suspicious by their lights, only to focus on the Muslim problem. All of a sudden, British values are not only weaponized against unassimilated Muslim populations, but they're weaponized against right-wingers who are always against going down this avenue in the first place. And so we're often told that at one time during the riots that followed the Southport slaughter in July of last year, one of these sort of fashionable multicultural creatures, he's actually written some good reports before, a black chap living in Britain called Trevor Phillips actually wrote, but this was awful, he wrote an essay, an article in the Times where he says it's the far right that needs to assimilate into modern Britain, not immigrants. Because once you have a values-based model of belonging, it's not actually unreasonable to say, well, we should test people on whether they're well drilled on these values. And if it turns out that they're not well drilled on these values, then people who can trace their lineage back in Britain hundreds of years, so long, well, if you don't sign up to the correct points on the hymn sheet, then you're not British at all. And in fact, Sadiq Khan is more British than you because he has a better hold on British values. And Reform is very, very guilty of not speaking in those terms, but of using the rhetoric of British values. And once you're doing that, you've already conceded massively. So I think that Reform UK, and of course, I mean, there have also been incidents where, well, firstly, I should mention they tried to throw my new boss in prison. I sort of mentioned that earlier, but you cannot reasonably advertise yourself as a movement that is going to restore Britain's finest traditions, not least around free speech, if you're reporting people to the police for allegedly hurty words said in meetings, Nigel Farage has also said on record that he is indifferent to the demographic dissolution of the white British population in Britain. He said it's something that doesn't trouble him in the least. He's also said that if we alienate Islam in Britain, if we alienate the rising Muslim population in Britain, we are going to lose by the middle of this century. So he, on both the kind of religious front and on the demographic front, he's giving off a posture of surrender about all of these things rather than wanting to tackle the problems from root. And then last of all, I would say that he plays into minoritarian games when it suits him. So, for instance, it's very noticeable that the two people who have actually not found themselves alienated from reform in the last 2 years are two individuals who've been over-promoted, in my view, clearly because of their ethnic background. You have Leila Cunningham, who is a reform counsellor, who's on all of the airwaves, giving all of the interviews. Nigel Farage seems to think that she can do no wrong, and she is part Egyptian heritage. And then you also have Zia Youssef, who, despite making all sorts of mistakes and kerfuffles and embarrassing the leader on multiple occasions, there was one time where he attacked one of the Reform's own MPs, Sarah Pochin, for making a comment about the burqa in Britain. He said it was a tasteless remark, and he got very cross about it, clearly embarrassing the party, airing dirty laundry in public, the sort of thing that would have seen Rupert Lowe thrown out like that. I mean, if fake bullying allegations were enough to get rid of him, then they certainly would have got rid of him for attacking a fellow MP. But Zia Youssef didn't get in any trouble for this, and as you can tell from Zia Youssef's name, he is a man of Muslim background from the subcontinent. So at every turn, it seems to me, Reform are constantly bemoaning certain the consequences of a worldview without wanting to grapple with the fundamentals of that worldview at all, and indeed, in many ways, exhibiting the worst features of that worldview. And we could roughly call that worldview kind of the left liberal pieties of civic nationalism. So they're constantly wedded to fighting on the terms of their enemies. And of course, even if you're winning on the terms of your enemies, you're not really winning in any ultimate sense at all. And so there's been a lack of serious political ambition on that front, and understanding that once we've gone through, as we have in Britain, a kind of silent revolution, you can't treat the norms and the patterns and the ways of speaking that owe their power to that revolution as authoritative. And this is the odd situation in which conservatives find themselves. Conservatism as a psychological modality is inclined to think that what has been inherited is in some sense good. But once you are not threatened with revolution, but have already experienced it, you can't really be a conservative anymore if your conservatism is solely devoted to preserving the gains, even unwittingly, of the revolution. You're not really doing much good. And so I think they find themselves in an awkward place like this. For instance, let me just say quickly, the last thing I'll say is that there are occasions when, if you read New Labour speeches, like Tony Blair's speeches from the early 2000s after 9/11, it actually sounds a little bit spicier than the sort of speech that someone like Nigel Farage would write today. And that's because, of course, we've been on a sort of worldview conveyor belt where the Overton window has been yanked pretty effectively to the left. So all of a sudden, being on the right side of that Overton window, which has been yanked to the left, in a meta sense, is actually still quite left wing, because you're not actually trying to yank it back. You're just being right wing within where it's been taken. And so I think that is the cardinal flaw of Reform UK. And at Restore Britain, we are avowedly against fighting on the terms of our enemies, because we realize that if that's what we're going to do, we may as well just concede and all go home.
I'm glad you said that, because there's a similar fight happening on the American right, and it's been raging for a long time. It is Christmas time when we're recording this, and it seems it is time for Ohio gubernatorial hopeful Vivek Ramaswamy to make his yearly crash out, attacking effectively American white people. And there were events sort of presaging this. There were things that led up to this. But the question comes around, what is it to be an American? Is that a sort of objective, definable thing? I am an American because my parents or my ancestors have been here since the 17th century. Or is it simply creedal, right? That you can stand on the magic dirt, say the magic words, and you too can run for governor of Ohio. And it's interesting to see the breakdown there, because as you've said, even people who are, by the standards of wider culture, considered quite conservative, Ben Shapiro is one, say things like, oh, no, of course, anyone can be an American. Anyone, it is simply a set of propositions. And once you have, submitted yourself to those, you have just the same, rights to this country as anyone else. And look, the history of American immigration is much longer and much different than your country. I do appreciate you giving us all of your convicts. They are, they do quite well here. But in all seriousness, right, it is sort of the worst import of America. The idea that, a nation is simply, an intellectual conclusion, something you can sort of sign off on, right? Like you sign up for a loan or something like that. It becomes commercialized. And it's been especially distressing to see this from the nominal MAGA movement, because there are strains of nativism. And when you talk to the people who are putting these men in power, they are nativists, largely speaking. And it's sort of a stupid throwaway thing, but even, Trump's idea of, I can't remember what he called it, like the gold card or something like that, where you pay $1 million and you're an American citizen. It's like, okay, well, maybe on a balance sheet that makes sense. You're taking in more than you're outlaying. The problem is as you've said, you've accepted the core premise that citizenship, the idea of being a part of this nation, is ultimately fungible. It's transferable. It can be given to anyone. And again, if that is the values which we are defending, we are accomplishing our enemy's goal for them. We are making their system more perfect, making it more efficient so that it can do what it was already doing better. And that's not what I, or I assume you, want. And it's especially distressing because, again, you mentioned the sort of cancellation, the kind of internecine knife fighting. We're in this sort of odd echo of what happened to the American right in the 90s, where the neoconservatives purged the paleoconservatives, albeit the issues have slightly shifted. And let's be honest, the relative power of both of those blocks have shifted. The kind of true right and the neoconservatives, I'll use that in place of a nastier word. But you see the exact same thing happening, which is, we have snatched a modicum of power. And the first thing they do is reaffirm the values of their enemies and push out anyone who's not on side. And part of the reason why many people, especially among the kind of younger cohort, are incredibly down on the Republican Party is exactly that. The same thing you have identified with Nigel Farage. And I'm glad you mentioned as well the kind of over promotion of these DEI hires. Look, the fact that Vivek Ramaswamy is on track to lose a state that voted for Trump by over or almost 10 points is notable, because you would assume if this were a company, if this were a normal institution, good performance would be rewarded and negative performance would be punished. In fact, we've been assured this is what's wrong with the woke left, with DEI. It's they don't pay enough attention to meritocracy. Well, when it's our diversity, when it's the guy that we want, even if he is representative of a group that votes against our interests 60-40 at best, 70-30 in most other elections, well, he gets to stick around forever. He gets to denigrate on, Christmas, the a fairly significant day in the culture of the country you're living in. He gets to denigrate the core voter base of his party. You say that they're incompetent, say that they're lazy, 2 years running, and seemingly faces no consequences. And again, look, like I understand that, I have benefited from, the second Trump administration. I'm not saying I want Kamala Harris in his place, but similarly, you were not eternally entitled to loyalty simply because one time you were a better alternative. Politics is ultimately transactional. And, in a time where both of our nations are relatively speaking in decline, sure, it's better than, Nairobi or, rural Pakistan. That's sort of damning by faint praise. But the idea that, you can simply ignore all, material and political conditions and just say, I was better at one time, support me forever. very clearly that idea is not holding water. And this sort of behavior, the eternal cancellation and the eternal adoption of their enemies' values, this is why conservatives are losers, like genuinely. Sam Francis's, beautiful losers thesis remains ultimately undefeated. Sorry, Harrison, I threw a bunch of...
No, I like it.
This is something I'm passionate about because, when you've seen this pattern happen over and over again in the face of mounting consequences, both of our nations have been swept by violence. Mine has been hit with left-wing political violence. Yours, violence committed by people brought in by the political left, which, arguably is the same thing. And you sort of want to, grab these people and shake them and say, like, do you not realize what the consequences are? Like, do you not realize that this is a very serious, dire situation? And playing out the same sort of playbook, the same sort of set of strategies that led us to this situation, just to hazard a guess, it might produce the same result. I'm no scientist, but that seems to be a logical conclusion.
I think so too. And yes, so the major problem with reform then in this context, and you're very usefully bringing in analogs in your own American context, is that reform can at best be counted upon to slow down the dispossession and eventual erasure of the host population of Britain. But I don't regard that as victory, because you're not. If that is all you're committed to, then you're happy to see the project through. You're just a stickler for the pace at which it happens, and if you're happy to see through an outcome as final as that, why does the pace really matter anyway? I mean, I suppose you could argue that when the pace is slower, you can make a pragmatic argument that it's a less troubled, less vexed process. But really, at this point, we're splitting hairs. And yes, in the American context too, I do. I'm not one of these European right wingers who wants to blame American exports for everything going wrong in the West today. The export in this case being sort of propositional nationalism, because I don't even view propositional nationalism as an authentic American tradition. It's one that was basically invented in the 1960s at the urging of people like, institutions like the ADL and with people like John F. Kennedy acting as a figurehead. But it's remarkable it's remarkable how long this sort of congenital cowardice has been afflicting the right, because I'm happy to wager. I mean, Calvin Coolidge, who I believe was a Republican president who passed the 1924 Immigration Act, he would never in a million years have said that America is a nation of immigrants, or that anyone can be an American or anything like this. Apart from anything else, he passed the 1924 Immigration Act with its explicit sort of national quota system, aimed not at being sort of absolute about according greater importance to certain ethnic groups over others, but it was more just saying we like America as it is. We're happy with its present demographic balance, and yearly immigration flows need to reflect that in terms of their ratios. So it wasn't even a complete shut door, but it was just, I think, a very pragmatic system. He would never have said that anyone can be an American or America is a nation of immigrants. But once JFK starts saying that in the 1960s and the political left in America runs with that, all of a sudden by the 1980s, you've got Ronald Reagan faithfully reproducing these same slogans as if they go back to Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and other iconic figures in the American founding. So I don't view it as authentically American progeny either. And if it isn't authentically American progeny, then it's definitely not authentically English or British progeny. But yes, people like Farage, they just sort of download that operating system, they run with it, because to do otherwise is believed to be to lead it by some circuitous route to the Third Reich and Auschwitz. This is the rough calculation that is made. The rough calculation that is made is that unless you have a kind of impeccably artificial, values-based understanding of national identity, the only possible alternative is a sort of demented, biomystical, blood-based form of national identity of the kind that someone like, in my view, Himmler more than Hitler represents in a pretty grotesque way. That is not logical, but nevertheless, that is that is where we find ourselves. And I think that partly explains the fact that many, not only on the kind of liberal IDW centrist types, but also many self-described right-wingers, they are genuinely more afraid of experimenting with potential remedies to our problems than they are of the disease itself. But they're able to notice symptoms, so occasionally they seem sound. But I think this is roughly where we find ourselves.
Well, and I think it's neatly encapsulated. I can't remember who he was quoting, but David French, who is sort of the perfect, good conservative, a man who has really no conservative values at all, but is sort of kept on as the house right winger at the New York Times. He quoted this other author saying, sort of contesting this idea that, America is in a bad way. And it's this profoundly kind of spineless idea. And he says, well, we may have drag queens, but at least we don't have slavery anymore. And okay, it's an absurd quote, but the idea is similarly, our national original sin, the thing for which we must apologize forever, anything that is an alternative to the excesses of yesterday's progressive regime, those are the only two options. You can either reaffirm the values of now, just Joe Biden, right? We haven't even gone that far back. It's not even, Bill Clinton. It's someone who is in power, a year and a half ago. Anything other than that, according to this kind of contained conservative worldview, is slavery. It is the ultimate ill. And okay, sure, you can say, well, is David French representative of the conservative movement? Well, yes and no. Because the specifics of that argument, the average, even the kind of worst rhino would say, oh, that's ridiculous, that's absurd. But you change the variables slightly, and it's basically the same formulation. It is either the progressive left, which we pretend to hate, but the alternative is too scary. It's too awful. It's the Third Reich. And this is an argument said explicitly by, odious kind of IDW centrists, Konstantin Kisin, James Lindsay and others. The idea that the real issue is not the excesses of the woke left, the excesses of, the globalist system. It is the idea that these excesses will promote the rise of a true radical right. And that's the worst thing in the world. That is the sort of reemergence of Satan on the world stage. And one, I think that's very clearly it's a false dichotomy. It's a false dyad. There are other options. There are, if we contend that the only two options are slavery and drag queen story hour, I would point to, America 15 years ago, which had neither one of those social ills. You don't even have to reach particularly far. And clearly, this argument, and again, this is an American context, but that same idea you find everywhere. If you really examined it and you pulled it apart like you would an argument in an essay, it doesn't stand up. But that's not why it's there. It's not really there to be the best argument ever. It exists as a combination of a scare tactic and a justification after the fact. And because ultimately, these people aren't actually interested in saving the country. They aren't really interested in reforming the UK deeply and really. They're not progressive explicitly, but you scratch a conservative and you find a progressive. It's just under the skin there.
I think this is really crucial. I think it's an excellent point you make there. This is a kind of performative. This is what in philosophy would be called much more a performative utterance than it is a kind of a tightly argued case. Because let's just probe the case a little bit, but on two things: civic nationalism, or proposition. Let's for the purpose of this conversation, let's call it propositional nationalism, or it's basically the same thing as far as I'm concerned, and meritocracy. When people like Ben Shapiro say that America is a creedal nation, in other words, it is a nation defined by its creed and the propositions that feed into that creed, all of a sudden we're forced to ask, okay, let's test citizens on how well they measure up to this standard that you were instituting, not just as ideal, like we want people in America to think this. You can say that if you like, but no, he's not saying we want people in America to believe in the rule of law, jury trials, free markets. He's saying that, no, he's not just saying that he wants America to believe these things. He's saying being an American is defined by belief in those things. Okay, great. Let's look at some of the polling then. On this criteria, you would have to denaturalize and potentially even deport half of the American population overall, because America is deeply divided on these questions. And rather more disconcertingly, given people's sensibilities in the post-war era, a majority of African Americans and a majority of Hispanics, because these populations in America are the ones that measure up least to the creedal values that Ben Shapiro is sort of articulating as sort of definitive aspects of American identity. Is he willing to do that? Is the Daily Wire willing to endorse those sorts of policies? I would suspect not. So I think that they know deep down that this isn't really a sustainable account of the boundaries of national belonging, because they're not willing to embrace what the consequences, the very draconian consequences of that supposedly liberating model of national identity would involve in practical policy terms. So again, it's a performative utterance. It is not a tightly argued case. And then on meritocracy, again, if you're actually going to argue for meritocracy within the American university system, you're going to have to accept some pretty volatile consequences when it comes to what the ratios of black attendance at Harvard will be. I think it's stamped at the moment, given that there are these affirmative action based racial preferences that have been instituted, I think, in America since the 1970s. It's not my country, so I don't know it as well, but I believe since the 1970s there has been affirmative action has put its thumb on the scale a bit when it comes to affecting how many African Americans go to elite universities in the United States. I think Harvard, when they were being sued by Asian students, because Asians actually bandy together and try and get redress of grievances on these sorts of things, Harvard admitted that if they were admitting without these affirmative action racial preferences on the basis of purely meritocratic test-based criteria, the black student population at Harvard would go from being 14%, which is roughly proportionate with the number of African Americans in the United States, to something like 0.6%. So you can bleat about meritocracy all you like, but unless you're willing to accept that as an overwhelmingly likely result of meritocracy, it is, again, just a performative utterance and a way of containing the right far more than it is the real right, than it is a good faith attempt at advancing a cogent worldview. And I think that you're absolutely right that we need to expose those tactics much more often, because they're very skin deep.
Well, and particularly relevant to Shapiro and others with similar beliefs. It's especially jarring when you see that they may be civic nationalists for our country, but they seem to be blood and soil for theirs. Another example, I'm not just picking on Ben Shapiro, is Ilhan Omar, who in her native language says, "I am here as a representative of your interests," speaking to her true constituents. She says, "My primary interest in Congress is making sure that Ethiopia doesn't take any more territorial waters of Somalia." And a rational person would say, "Well, you live very far away from that on the map. Not only just your nation, but your state in particular, is almost about as far away as you could get." But nonetheless, right, that it is the civic values, this kind of, weak gruel for you and I. But for them, for her, for, another, shall we say, far off small country, it is, the full blood and soil, full strength, brew. And when you combine that, you again understand why there is a large amount of discontent, because it seems plainly unfair. This is, off something we saw with, Vivek as well, right? This kind of like burning resentment towards the legacy population of the country that he lives in. And many people who are, and I posit that American conservatives are genuinely the least racist people in America, those who have bought into the civic nationalism the most. That's a slap in the face, because it's, well, we have, put you up on a pedestal. We championed you. We've advanced you well above what you probably would be doing if you were not named Vivek Ramaswamy. And in turn, that has been repaid with this sort of incredible scorn, a way that even as someone who's not particularly sensitive to progressive moral sensibilities would not talk about anyone, let alone publicly, as an elected official. And I think that that's sort of an interesting, element to it. My friend James Kirkpatrick has this great line. It's like, well, everyone is a blood and soil nationalist for what they really care about. And that's sort of the dissonance about it, that many of these figures in the media and in politics and again, across the political spectrum, right? Ben Shapiro, Kissen, Ilhan Omar. I'm sure there are, domestic versions, for, the Brits, but seemingly out of one side of their mouth advocate the same values that led us to this place, the same values of the allegedly horrible, woke left, the biggest scare, the thing we have to attack. They advocate them when it is in their own interest. But when it's their people, they say things that would get you thrown in jail. And you start to wonder, like, well, wait a minute, like, what is the deal being offered to the legacy population? And when you really strip down to it, effectively, the deal offered to Americans, offered to, the English, is effectively, you're a battery. You exist to fund this patronage network. And if you complain about it too much, if you complain about the fact that your country is no longer yours or is no longer ruled by people who are like you, well, that's the real threat. Despite all the, the wailing and screaming and gnashing of teeth about, every time I say the woke left, you can put scare quotes around it, because that term is sort of passé. But that all goes away. And that's the real issue. The fact that you object to that relationship. And I will say, to sort of put a coda on this, and I'll throw it back to you. It's why I've been very much encouraged by what I have seen on the sort of the true right in both of our countries, because there is clearly some sort of resistance to this. And I love talking to sort of our elder statesmen within this, the guys who've been here for 30 and 40 years, because yeah, sure, demographics are way worse. The anarcho-tyranny is way worse, but the resistance then was nominal. My buddy Thomas always says, if you had a newsletter with 100 people on it, you were the biggest deal in the world. And now, I mean, look, like, we could take Substack as a direct analogy. If you have 100 subscribers on Substack, that's nothing. You can do that in an afternoon in a particularly pointed essay, right? If you really, put your mind to it. And I think that is a sort of a silver lining to this cloud. Anyway, Harrison.
No, I very strongly agree. And I think that, frankly, while I understand why there is a lot of frustration with Trump at the moment, he cannot be thanked enough for just blowing things open in this way. Could you imagine if it had been Jeb Bush versus Hillary Clinton in 2016?
We'd still be pleased clapping to this day.
Yeah. Illegal immigration is an act of love. There would be all this sort of stuff. And while Trump does, because he's a boomer, and he does fall into a lot of these self-defeating premises himself at times. But because his rough attitude to the overreach of the left, or perhaps better said, the logical conclusion of sort of left liberal orthodoxies was to hit back twice as hard and to really kind of shatter the mold of not just American politics, but Western politics. He has enabled other people. He was a pretty clumsy weapon himself for blowing open the castle doors. But now, sort of, now that the gates have been breached, as it were, more nimble actors are able to make gains in a way that they wouldn't have done but for the big sort of stampeding orange orangutan who had smashed through things in the first place. And so, yes, this definitely does exist now, and it's very encouraging both in your context and in mine.
Well, one point, and then I have another question, because this is something I genuinely don't understand. I should have brought it up earlier, but I think when we look back on the Trump era, and this does feel like the Trump era, shifting the Overton window is a huge part of it. Definitely. I think that the other sort of more unsung detail here is sort of shifting the conceptual landscape, what is perceived to be possible. Because very quickly we realized, for all of his faults, you actually can just stop illegal immigration. It is a choice. And sure, and that is separate from the issue of mass deportations. It's separate from the issue of H-1Bs. But I was told for my entire life that was an impossibility. There was simply no way to do it. It was the inevitable consequence. And this was something our politicians learned from Blair, which is the ability to sort of set yourself as the null hypothesis. So, when Tony Blair, and I don't remember the name of it, but in the 90s, got rid of firearms in your country largely. The framing was, the conversation has been had. We've all arrived at this. And similarly, that's how illegal immigration was portrayed. All the adults understand that you can't make this go away. It's simply a part and parcel of having a country. And once you find out, like, oh no, you can say no. This can go away. Well, that completely shifts the conceptual landscape. I mean, another one, and this issue is sort of faded from public prominence, but getting rid of Roe versus Wade, right? This issue that conservatives have been arguing for since before my parents were born. Turned out like, oh no, that was something you could do away with. And, do abortion still happen? Is there still, this fight about it? 100%. But this huge, impediment, which was seen as being unassailable, this idea that, the progressives just get what they want forever. Well, that facade has been blown apart. And I think that is conceptually massively important, because now you have young guys confidently saying things that simply could not be said 5-10 years ago. I won't, say the most radical, but I'm sure you're, filling it in your own place. I think this is a complete. Oh, sorry.
Oh no, well, I was just going to say, I think that fact, and I couldn't agree with you. I couldn't possibly agree with you more. I think that has also done had another inadvertent, but in my view, very welcome side effect of making the left declare what they're really about. Because when they were constantly winning, because the right was only ever pyrrhically scoring victories itself, things like replacement migration could be sort of presented as the null hypothesis, as just an inexorable fact of living in a global world and all this sort of thing. And they were able to market it like candy floss, in a way that, but once the right starts scoring victories, people start saying what they're really about. And only the other day, what's the name of that? I forget. There's an American in your country, some Indian guy who only the other day was saying, you shouldn't have let us into your country. He's a big name. I can't remember who he is, but I can't remember whether
unfortunately, Harrison, some Indian guy in your country does not narrow it down in the slightest.
These days, that's true. But I forget what he's called, but he from the subcontinent, and he was saying, do you know what the real problem is? You shouldn't have let a single one of us into your country in the first place, because now there are too many of us here, and we're just going to take it over. And it's conquest, whether you like it or not. All of a sudden, they enter sinister mode, or they enter the gloating mode. And that's very helpful because it clarifies the battle lines. And one of the reasons why we have been ill-equipped to resist this process of replacement migration that is afflicting all of our countries, but America and Britain, certainly it is afflicting, is because it has been a kind of, it's been unarmed conquest rather than armed conquest. And when you're being, invaded by a national army with sort of quaint uniforms and all the rest of it, it's easier to muster the stomach for resistance because the threat is so apparent. But when it's invisible, when it's procedural, when its effects are for the moment just sort of bureaucratic and insidious and all the rest of it, and when it's marketed as just a sort of part and parcel of a natural process and peaceful, it's harder to resist. And now that it's becoming clearer what the motivations of our colonizers, if you like, really are, it's easier to mobilize the appetite for a serious resistance, because the worse things get, and they are getting very bad, and the more obvious the costs of this sort of reckless experiment with diversity get, the more people start thinking, oh, well, it seems like I face a choice between losing my country. Between keeping my country and getting called racist, or losing my country and still getting called racist. Well, in that case, I choose to keep my country. And I think that the fact that really is the binary of this century is just coming into sharper focus. And one of the reasons it's coming into sharper focus is because the right score initial victories, the left start hyperventilating in ways that reveal their true motives. And people then realize, oh gosh, we need to keep winning. We can't just score some victories. We need to score serious, long-term, ultimate victories. Otherwise, we know what these people really think about us now.
Yeah, there's a great essay from a guy I don't particularly like, Catgirl Kulak on Substack. The name is enough of a reason, but I have others as well. And anyway, he made the great argument where he compared Donald Trump to a peanut butter sandwich. And he said, the US government is going into anaphylactic shock, right? The immune system has incorrectly assumed that these peanuts are toxic, that they're going to, kill it. So they're freaking out, right? They're activating all of the switches available to them. And it's completely innocuous, but that reaction can kill it. And look, I think that we're sort of witnessing a moment where Trump is sort of being absorbed, at least partially, or co-opted by, kind of the neocon establishment, which is a separate discussion. But nonetheless, I think that sort of supervillain monologue, that's sort of something that you'd roll your eyes at in a movie. The fact that is being produced, the fact that you have people saying like, oh, well, we should just throw all these people in jail, send them to The Hague. The idea that, we're going to come back and stomp on you forever. I mean, that's not a good move politically. But this, as you said, this orange orangutan has sort of produced that response. You sort of allowed them to self-sabotage in a way that I think is interesting. So maybe this is the me going through the stages of grief, right? And sort of, reaching acceptance with it. But I do think that that's sort of, an interesting way to look at it, that, he could have been normalized. He could have been brought in and we could have just, made some concessions, and the horrible globalist project would have, slowed down slightly. And as you said, this sort of replacement would have resumed its kind of role as like a, just a bureaucratic inevitability. Mm-hmm. But because they couldn't, they have now created an awareness. A great example of this, and I was talking to a trucker about this last night, is these kind of spate of, horrific, attack or horrific crashes, accidents. Yes. I learned you're not supposed to say accident. You're supposed to say a crash because it could have been prevented.
Good point.
But point is, he said, like, this is an issue that's been going on for decades, but because of, one, the climate around immigration, and two, the fact that people were essentially stoked up into a rage, all of a sudden this has become an issue that is no longer simply, one of the many things that, a minority of people is upset about, to a major issue. And so I think that, the kind of insane reaction of the left has sort of produced a much healthier right-wing resistance. It's still nascent. It's not done yet. It's not in power. But again, if we look at that trend line, it's ultimately positive. But Harrison, we're over time, man. It was great to have you on. I really enjoyed this conversation. But where can people find you, man?
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it too. Very stimulating. We should make sure to have another one in the not too distant future. People can find me. I think my handle on Twitter is Harry_Pitt, Pitt. I do a monthly show for the European Conservative magazine called The Forge, where I've interviewed and had lively exchanges and debates with all sorts of interesting figures. And of course, most importantly of all, at Restore Britain, my workload at Restore Britain is a little bit more periodic, in that it takes a long time to write, sort of long, comprehensive reports about trying to embark on a policy of mass deportations. Our next one is going to be on coming out next month, hopefully, and it's going to be on like restoring England's, and indeed by extension Britain's, but primarily England's finest common law traditions around self-defense and the integrity of the home in an age of anarcho-tyranny. So in like bringing back ordered freedom as the sort of the corrective to anarcho-tyranny in the British context, because we in Britain have been much less protective in a paradoxical way of our common law traditions than you have in the United States. I know things are bad there. You still have some pretty good practical wisdom embedded into your legal tradition. We've been busily jettisoning that over the last 100 years, and it's high time that it were restored. And so that will be our next paper. So if you go on the Restore Britain website and follow Rupert Lowe on Twitter and follow the Restore Britain page on X, you will get a good sense of what we're trying to do to set things right here in the mother country.
Well, good. There were a few issues that I get, obviously my own nation, of course, first, but there are a few things that affect me more emotionally than what goes on in your nation. Obviously, as we've said, there's a great degree of, cultural and genetic overlap. But Man, I hope you win. The politicians in your country the crime cannot be overstated. This is something where I have to be careful. I will say very radical things, but
careful for my sake, given that.
Well, that's what I'm thinking of course. But genuinely, I hope you win. You're doing the Lord's work. So everyone, as much as you can, support this endeavor. Follow them on social media. As far as my stuff, Jay Burden Show, Apple, Spotify, YouTube. If you want to pay me a few bucks a month, get the episodes early and ad free. It comes up to 15 cents an hour, right? For the content. It's a pretty good deal if I do say so myself. And it's what I do. So I appreciate your support. Check out our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness Coaching. I think they're doing some sort of Christmas special. So if you're interested, maybe check it out. Either they are, or I made that up, in which case JD will be forced to do it because I've now said it on air, which is ultimately the same thing. But yeah, Harrison, I'll have to have you on again. This was a great conversation. And everyone at home, keep your head up. Life can't last forever. Good night.